So we're going to go straight to Alan first. So first question, what are the key differences when coaching speed to youth athletes versus adults? I think that'll kick us off quite nicely for this topic.
Yeah, so you sent me this question before, and I was really thinking hard about it. I was like, is it different or is it not different? And I came back to the kind of conclusion that in principle, it's really not that different. There's some fundamental principles that we utilize and coach towards, and that means that it's still the same thing. So I was asking myself the question, and when I think about acceleration, I'm thinking, well, can I go forwards and can I displace my hips maximally and project myself at an optimal angle and maximize my ratio of force, which is basically just inputting as much horizontal force into the total force I can produce and minimizing braking forces that allow me to, I guess, climb out of my acceleration and minimize my ground contact times, increase my air contact times, and all the things that we associate with smooth data. And then during upright running, it's really about a cycle. It's kind of prepare for the ground by separating my thighs and attack the ground really hard with a level of stiffness, which means that I don't compress and sink on landing, and then reverse that movement and repeat the cycle over and over again. And then in terms of that, that's all framed within good positive posture that allows that energy transfer coming across our pelvis. And when I think about coaching kids and I think about coaching adults, I don't see there to be that much of a difference there. But how you deliver it is vastly, vastly different. And I think maybe most importantly for me, the things that you value are very, very different. So in terms of how you deliver it, kids don't really want to stand there for hours going through postural drills. Like, that's boring and it disengages them. But it is important. And then the other side of it is actually they just want to run fast and chase their mates and have a good time within the coaching session, but there's still this element that you've got to provide an education. So what we try and do is I always have a few pictures saved to my phone. And these are pictures of postures that have been drawn in cartoon style. And we talk a lot about the shapes that we want to try and achieve, the analogies and the kind of metaphors that we can give them. And all the while placing it in this environment that we value technical change and their engagement in that technical change rather than the numbers. It really doesn't bother me too much if a 14-year-old is running X or Y, as long as they're engaged and they can look at a screen and review their own session and say, oh, well, my thighs are a bit closer at touchdown, or actually I feel like my bum is more pushed through, and they're happy to give peer review. And then they're happy to judge themselves and get excited on technical change rather than just pure performance measures. I think that's where the difference lies. And I think the biggest thing about that is that actually, if you inspire and install education in kids, that's when they really want to, engage and come back. Because you could deliver the best technical session in the world, like you could nail everything. But if it's too boring and all you do is focus on postures and really, really static work, then I think you lose them, if I'm honest. And if you lose them, it doesn't matter how good your session is because they aren't coming back to you. So you never get to do it again anyway. So it's all about fun and driving education. For me, that's the biggest thing. And the fundamental principles are very similar.
Just one question off the back of that before I let these guys, Micheál and John, jump in. At what point is technical mastery actually even considered? Like, is there an age where it's just about having fun and try to run as fast as possible? Like, I know that's not a clean cut answer. Like, oh, as soon as they hit 11, like, we start caring about it.
Yeah.
But is there a general area where below 12, it's just about fun? It's just about running fast. We don't actually care about technicalities.
I think I'm almost kind of going full circle on my own answer. I actually think that there's an element of fun and education in every session that you do, regardless of how old they are or how young they are. Like, I still think even if you're coaching professional athletes, there has to be an element of engagement and almost that feeling of joy to be able to make that change, that technical change. I think technical mastery is an interesting one. I personally think there's always something we can strive to be better at, so maybe that doesn't exist. But certainly it's more biased towards fun and engaging and less about scrutinizing a video and looking at kinematics and data the younger you are. But there is still an element of that in the coach's head when you're looking at a 12-year-old. It's just not popping up on a screen. You're recognizing that relatively they're not as strong. So the bandwidth for them to run well or technically well is a little bit less. Their foot's going to land a little bit more vertically because they don't have the relative strength qualities to propel themselves forwards as much. But we're still thinking about, okay, well, how can we help them understand how to maybe navigate themselves or orientate themselves a little bit more horizontal, reduce their contact times with our language. But certainly there's an element of those two things in every session, I think. So yeah, I'm not sure what the other guys think about that one, but that's certainly what I think. I think you're right. There's not a clear-cut answer like 12 years old, we go from just running after each other to like now we're on the iPad and we're doing reviews.
Yeah. Have you guys got any, Micheál, John, any ideas on that? Any input? Feel free.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, John, I'll go if you I like Alan's answer because, you know, the first thing to me, the forefront, especially dealing with kids, is it has to be the coaching pedagogy. And we're not coaching Excel spreadsheets. What is absolutely the best technical model in the world in an Excel spreadsheet, if the athlete or the child isn't engaging in it, if they don't value it, it's not going to transcend regardless of the 50-step progression on the Excel spreadsheet. So I think I totally agree with that. I probably go a little bit, an area that's close to me is some of the growth and maturational aspects within childhood. And one of the things I always say is that although we're trying to develop speed, we're also developing speed with the natural development of the central nervous system and even, you know, your gait being fully formed by 8. So fully agree with Aaron's responses. And that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that with Alan's response, that doesn't mean that you hone in and you get this very technical mastery model by a certain age. Because my thing is low structure, high velocity movements during that pre-peak height velocity kind of phase. And I think from a speed standpoint that we know they adapt well to plyometrics, and sprinting being the greatest plyometric of all, that can actually prepare the muscle tendon unit more and better, and you won't dampen their central nervous system pre-peak height velocity. They'll sprint top speed, tons of reps, and that in turn can actually prepare the tendons to be able to attenuate the forces that are going to be placed upon them during the growth spurt and the stresses that come with that. And, you know, the last thing I'll add, just differentiating between maturity, the practical application stays the same and the coaching pedagogy will trump it. But I think it's important for the coaches just to be cognizant of maturity induced gains versus actual training induced gains. And I'm not sure if I can say this on this, Rob, but my dad always said to me that a pat in the back is only 6 inches away from a kick up the arse. So before the coaches are patting themselves on the back with the training, with the gains they got, it's important to differentiate how much maturity placed in that, because we actually see that, you know, gains will go increase about 3% in sprint performance, but at and after the growth spurt, they get severed in half to less than 1% per year in sprint performance. And that's when we need to get more structured. So like Alan said, I'm much more low structure, high velocity, prepare them for the growth spurt during it. And then as they age, just like the YPD model, we go from a low to a moderate to a more high structure as we start to see different aspects. One last thing on the maturity thing, you know, during the growth spurt, again, I like some of the maturational stuff. You could have one of these athletes go through adolescent awkwardness, and you can try and implement all the technical drills in the world, won't be able to compensate from the hips growing or the legs growing at a disproportionate rate to the torso. So I felt like just adding just with that, it's not only development of speed in youth, it's running parallel with the development of the actual child and the biological development of the central nervous system.
We'll come back to that adolescent awkwardness in a minute, but John, were you going to add something there?
Yeah, and I know it's going to kind of bleed into the next question as well. But largely in my role, I work with large groups, and I'll work with groups. Potentially, it could go as young as our lower school, which is talking about anywhere from maybe 5 to 10 years old. And then certainly in a larger capacity, our middle school, which will be, 11 to 13 or 14. And then our high schoolers certainly from 14 to 18. And, of course, in an ideal setting, in an ideal situation, we can work with somebody for longer than that. But I think one of the big things, especially in working with a large group, in addition to what these guys said, which hit on so many key points, is taking the opportunity. Now, there's still going to be those certain guidelines and rules and certain things I think we want to look for from a technical standpoint for everybody. The ways that we introduce it, the ways that we communicate it are absolutely going to be different. But also for us in an ideal situation where we are able to spend a great amount of time, meaning years, with some of these young people, I think the big takeaway is really almost not so much in identifying what's going to be best for them, but what our own reflection is going to encourage us or show us about the ways that they move. So the more time that we have with them is more exposure to that athlete or to that group of athletes. Some of the things that we do are for the purpose of being able to identify a couple key movement signatures, the more we coach them, the more we realize that certain words resonate, certain words don't. Maybe we'll keep that with us for a more extended period of time. So I think more so than just thinking, okay, when they hit the middle school age, which is going to be certainly different from a training standpoint of what they're doing in the lower school. When they hit high school age, it's going to be different. Yeah, we're going to be talking a little more technical when they get to that age. It's more so, well, we see some of those movement signatures start to develop when they're in the 6th grade, 11 years old. How does that come into the fold? How does that bear its head when they're a varsity level athlete or a potential future college athlete, where we are discussing more technical, fine details, and they're more advanced, more mature, able to handle some of that coaching, because certain cues, certain technical models that might be a fit for one young man or woman is going to be completely different from somebody else. So to kind of like pigeonhole them in one age group or one time without really having a big picture idea about them, to me would be misinformed decision.
John, go on, Alan. You were going to jump in there. Go on, mate.
Yeah, I think that's such an awesome point. Like, speed. Everybody sees speed as this one single thing, like it's just speed. But actually, because it's the top of the pyramid in terms of what people can do as a complex system, it tells you so much about what they do as a person and where their limitations and their kind of strengths lie. And I think that has such a huge influence if you are working with really young kids. And say you're working with a 13-year-old and he is completely quad dominant and he just wants to use his quads to run, and he has no posterior chain, he can't displace his hips, he wants to use his spine, all the stuff that you see really commonly. Well, actually, if I'm an S&C coach and I've got a good medical team around about me and enough support, then I think I'm going to start to make an intervention that moves towards the things that I can already see from the signatures that Sean's talking about. And I think that's when really high-end stuff starts to come in, rather than just everybody doing the same thing and we all tick boxes. I think it does give you some really cool clues to what you should be doing as a coach.
I was going to come to John on another point, but Alan and Micheál, feel free to jump in as well. So with these large groups, John, I see it, and we probably see it from the UK point of view. We see you guys dealing with large groups over in the US, high school, college, etc. Is there any tips that you would give to people who are in that situation to manage such a large group and get the outcomes that you want out of everyone, if that's even possible?
Sure. First and foremost, I mean, and this is going to go into coaching philosophy and methodology for me, at least a little bit, is coming from, and this is universal, I think, for all sports, but especially in American football, I think that's like our greatest exposure early on here. That was my biggest exposure. Film is everything. So the things that occurred from a learning and coaching standpoint off the field, meaning recording practices, recording whatever's happening in an individual session, was equally, if not more important than what was happening on the field. So I think a little of that has stuck with me, along with working with and learning from high level coaches, in that when you have a large group like that and it becomes very challenging to coach and get very specific with an individual because of how large your group is, you want to be conscious, of course, of the time that you're using. You want to be conscious of coaching everybody. The time that you can use off the field, off the track, whatever it may be, is equally as important. So where that comes into play is like filming sessions, filming repetitions, and I can get into that a little bit more, but largely that's a big piece. Then what happens when we're in our sessions, and again, kind of getting philosophy related or just kind of background on me. I think one of the things, my strength, I love being with large groups, but one of my weaknesses actually, I feel like is my cueing, my coaching ability, my words that I use in a session. So a lot of what I use to inspire the programming of our sessions comes more from the kind of perspective of a motor learning, skill acquisition, applying constraints, using methods that the words don't necessarily drive what the athlete is doing. And I think from something that's so dynamic and so complex as sprinting, as really any field movement, that's probably more in the direction that we want to be anyway. I don't think words are always the answer. So with that said, not to get too off on it, but a couple of things that we really like to use. We like to use some of the motor skills that maybe they might have missed out in their lower school physical education, from a skips, gallops, certainly introducing and progressing towards bounding. That is definitely something that's certainly that's really meaningful for us, and the progression has to be such that, again, it's not working with one individual. So using some of those kind of methods of practice that I feel more so are kind of in the realm of motor learning versus X's and O's, strength and conditioning, track and field, I think has been really beneficial there. In addition to that, I already mentioned constraints. We actually, in a group session, especially, like, we're not going to bring out wickets, certainly for our young kids, but for some of the more advanced ones, I'm actually not using that in our large group setting because I feel like it is something that needs to get a little more specific. And generally, coaches are probably surprised by that because a lot of what I share on social media includes wickets, but that's generally in different sessions. That's like an additional session that we're doing, or it's something that I have a little more time with our athletes on a Saturday or something like that, that it's actually not going to be with our teams or sports on campus. So a lot of the constraint-based drills, dowel and implement related sprints and what have you have been really for the purpose of filling a void or filling what I feel like we're missing when we're not using a wicket drill, which I think is a very an excellent constraint-based drill. So using some of those, and then plyometrics are really important as well. And I think what you can do general strength wise, I think a lot of that, those kind of concepts can be applied to a large group, and they're still going to be able to, again, it's creating an environment that the athletes are still able to create their own solution for whatever the problem is. It's not going to be something that's going to be these words or what we use. It's more so, this is the environment, these are the challenges that we lay out. And an athlete, again, and that goes into what I said about being able to look at our athletes over time and seeing how an athlete gallops, seeing how an athlete learns how to bound, sometimes teaches me more about what we want to use on the sprint side of things, or some of the cues or some of the tools that we want to use on the sprint side of things, that is going to teach me even more using some of those drills than just going out and watching a sprint. A sprint could be flying by me. It's way faster, very dynamic. Sometimes it's hard for us as coaches to create solutions to the problems that the athletes lay in front of us. So those are some of the methods. Hopefully I wasn't just talking in a circle, but again, kind of locomotive plyometrics with galloping, skipping, bounding is really important to us. Constraint-based sprinting, and at the end of the day, it comes back to sprinting at maximal efforts. With the younger athletes, it's generally going to be races or tag or something like that, whereas a higher level, more advanced, more experienced athlete, high schoolers that have a little more ego, maybe races, absolutely, but also maybe some timing or some other metrics that we can put on there that we know that they're sprinting for maximal effort. And at the end of the day, we're going to get something out of that as well.
Superb. Thanks, John. We'll come back to that constraints-based approach in a second. Micheál, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think, again, just the coaching pedagogy kind of on it is paramount. And I'd be similar to John in the approach that we try and have, is that the coach understands why they're doing it and not just a list of what they do. I think one of the most powerful principles of training you can combine is progression and variety. And I always encourage them to, if you can create progressive variety based off the situation and the environment you've created, and you know how to work it with your group, because we can't always do the best. We can only do the best available, because environments will change, group numbers will change, your what you have available to you has changed. So one of the parameters that we use is, for all age groups within youth, is firstly, we allow them to express speed, and the coach, dependent on how structured it is, with it being a little more structured as they age, like we could be emphasizing acceleration or max velocity. At the latter ages, earlier ages, it's more exploratory. But the coach stands in, and this is the coaching pedagogy, their observation zone, be it the first 5 yards of the sprint that they're sprinting for 20 to 25, and actually stands in that observation zone and observes what's happening. The next part, and it's a whole part, whole approach. The next part we do is teach speed. And to me, that's where you need to slow down to speed up. And what we try and do is break the emphasis down into different skill acquisition parts. Typically, being within the teach, or the part being, if you've timed 3 drills, which would be a drill that emphasizes on the control of force, slow down to speed up, then a drill that emphasizes the production of force, and lastly, your ability to redirect that force cyclically. And those 3 things, can you control it, produce it, and redirect it, slow down to speed up? As the athlete progresses, gets better acutely or with time and age, you increase the complexity of it. But then, to me, the real key to seeing if it was successful is then our compete phase. So they express, teach, compete, and that then is where we see that it come together, that they compete internally against the clock or their previous best time, or they compete externally against a person within the group they're training with, or as a whole team, and who wins it. And you stand back to see, what did you try and implement? Did you see the change in an open chain environment? And like John said, sometimes we'll get them. It doesn't mean you have to go back all the way to the exact perfect technical model. If you're really trying to get a forward lean, and let's say you're coaching an aspect with a constraint, you may get them to compete maximally with the constraint also, if you're in a smaller group. Because like John, I don't want to be carrying out 60 wickets, or 600 wickets out there as well to set up for people. So same with resisted stuff. And I did it, and it was about a 2-hour setup for a group of 60 athletes with sleds and stuff. We'll get into that later. Yeah. So, and the other last thing is just looking at different approaches, like a waterfall approach can be a big help as well, while standing in that observation zone. And then you might be able to individualize it. I mean, 1-to-1 training is the best training you can do, but who has 24 hours to individual training with everyone? So that's all I got on that.
Perfect, mate. Alan, did you unmute your mic to say anything, or was that?
Yeah, just it made me reflect on my time working in the rugby academy, and that like stress of like trying to figure out, shit, how am I gonna watch like layers of 10 kids at a time and give them cues? And what we ended up doing was we formed, so they would sprint, or they would run fast, or they would do a variation twice a week. And I would pick 4 guys within a session. And usually we were working with the backs, which was about 15 to 20 kids. And over the course of 2 weeks, we'd be able to, or I'd be able to give feedback specifically to them. And then we'd also use this other thing where, so the warm-up was like progressive through the weeks, but it had variability within the warm-up. So kind of like Micheál saying there, like, progression and variability is key. You can't just do the same thing over and over again. Adaptation stagnates. Probably more importantly, people just get pissed off and they don't want to do it. It's so boring. So what we did was we varied it, we progressed it. We would pick 4 guys, we would give them feedback, and then we had breakout zones. So I actually stole this off an England rugby coaching award when I was like 18, and they had little skill breakout zones, and we pull 4 out. We go over the thing that they hadn't done maybe correctly, whether it was a scissor, maybe it was a dribble, maybe it was an A march, whatever it was. We'd spit them back into the warm-up, and it would give them another chance to go through it. And we would do that on a cyclical basis. And what we saw, and this is again referring back to what Micheál said about maturation, what we saw was everybody got faster and everybody got technically better. Now, was that because of maturation? Definitely had an influence. They were 16, 17, everybody's getting stronger and bigger. But certainly from a technical element, that actually solved a problem that existed for me within a setting that John's talking about, where there's just loads of kids running around and it's very hard to see what's going on. So yeah, that's just a personal experience that I kind of employed, and it seemed to work quite well.
Perfect. Thanks, mate. Sorry to move things on a little bit quickly, but we are halfway through already. Just coming to Micheál for the next one. As we get more technical, potentially kids get further on in the development, a little bit older. Tips to coaching the key sprint positions, key speed positions that we're looking to hit. And we can go individual, we can go big groups. Is there any tips that you would give coaches out there on that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, it cropped up there, just some of the cueing, the cues of what you're trying to achieve, the stimulus, and how that is you're trying to get the adaptation. I think just a story from mine is I mentioned about control force, produce force, and redirect force. That's solely for the coach. I never used the word force with an athlete because I did it once and I came back and after 5-6 weeks and he was actually just stomping the ground. That was his interpretation of force and acceleration, just trying to make as loud a stomp as he could. So you have to be very careful with the internal and external. I think just on a coaching or a cueing element, one of the most neglected and areas is, it's always triple extension, hip extension, but sometimes we forget about one of the success I have had is encouraging hip flexion in it and maximal, because it's cyclical in nature. And that maximal hip flexion, something simple as putting a dot on their knee to get them front side mechanics to lift the dot, will actually in turn through a cyclical action make them get into hip extension. And it's punch, push, punch, push. I know Ken Clark, be a good friend of mine, and he's always emphasized that as well. It was always one that stuck with me. To be honest, the two lads, Alan and John, could probably give you a lot more of the technical areas that they see and work with. Some of the things that I try and do is sometimes work with track and field coaches and implementing different things to complement, because it's so multifactorial. And just some of the stuff I think is key is not only we're left with so much limited time to work on sprint, and especially in team sports, that it's important that you can intertwine some of the ancillary aspects of this within your warm-up, within your preparatory phases that aid and support sprinting. So, one of the big things we have in our warm-ups is just in a simple ramp is we focus on, over a progression, we'll focus on a more of a global postural control, which is that heel to toe, which could be as simple as having their hands behind their head, elbows back. And if ever they can see their elbows in their peripheral vision, that's when your chest drops, you're going to have your hips behind you, which you can't have an acceleration. Then we'll move to more proximal control, like a 3-bucket pose, and ensuring the hip and the pelvis is stable, move that to some dynamic movements in it. And then, we might intertwine some aspects of distal integrity. I think the ankle is one of the areas that's really neglected, and just something as simple as putting a coin under the ball of someone's foot, having to push into the coin and then lift their toes off the ground, and then progressing that further into proper kind of plyometrics. There's just some of the small stuff we intertwine outside of it. Specific to the sprint aspect, one thing for majority of a lot of the athletes we train now at Athlete Training Health are they're team sport athletes. They're not out and out technical sprinters. They're team sports and they're limited with time. And actually have one of our coaches is doing a PhD and I'm supervising it. And it's looking at pickup acceleration and transitional acceleration. And we're actually looking at some of the aspects of being able to, for that, being able to have them drop their center of mass and do a false step and actually reposition their body properly on an anticipated go call. So moving from walk to sprint or jog to sprint or sprint to sprint, and actually looking at some of that pickup acceleration. It's a kind of a whole different area one of our coaches, Mark Pryor, is looking for. But again, we just using some constraints to try and get the blended approach of how do we affect it kinetically most and how do we affect proper kinematics. So, and look, some of the key positions the guys can probably speak to, that we do look for. That is where that came from me, was a technical sprint coach telling me that from a team sport, you never want to step back to go forward, whereas you actually do. You want to actually step within your center of mass to gain momentum into your sprint. So some elements like that, and just looking at no daylight between the knees, trying to minimize that, really emphasizing front side mechanics. A lot of where the key position starts with me is postural control from heel. That's the key foundation of me, postural control.
Cool, thanks, mate. John, anything to add there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, those were a lot of great points. And anybody that's kind of, I guess, ever heard me discuss speed would know that the Altus kinegram method really changed my outlook on speed development. and kind of how I look at just a biomechanical approach to sprinting. So positions are key and necessary for me as a coach, I think, to identify and look at a kinogram or look at any sort of still. You could look at a video. That's nice that you're able to, again, that's a big part of kind of my coaching methods, being able to slow things down. You are limited because probably it's one dimensional, but you're probably not going to move about an athlete while they're sprinting anyway. Some of those still shots that you can find from those, and you can put into a kinogram or put into some other, whatever method really you want to look at those images. It's nice to see those still images as a coach. We can identify some changes over time. It might give us a hunch of something that's working versus something that's not. And again, that's something that you can really track over time. When you start, and our athletes, I like to educate our athletes on some of these positions, but I think that can be limiting in speaking about some of the very specific positions, because the positions are just a representation of what's happening ultimately. It's not, although we can put those 5 positions in a kinogram and it's super helpful from a coaching and observation standpoint, sprinting is just it's not just a collection of positions. It's really what happens to help those athletes find those positions. So again, it kind of then still comes back to us of, okay, if this is something that I'm seeing an athlete, maybe this is a position that I see them struggling with, maybe in full support. There's quite a bit of hindsight mechanics. Maybe there's something else that's going on that might be individual to the athlete or might be a little more global for our groups. I think that then might impact our programming and progressions or some of the constraints versus necessarily sitting down with an athlete and saying, hey, this is what you want to look like on toe off, because they're going to be thinking about it. And again, it's just not a collection of positions. There's some drills that for context, we'll try to set up an athlete in that position and help them find that position. But again, it's ultimately about them feeling it more so than anything that I can sit them down and talk to them about, or even coach on the fly as they're sprinting.
Cool, thanks, mate. I'm just going to come to Alan on a little bit of the point that's been made, and it's the ability to slow things down to actually pick up things that need to be addressed. John mentioned the galloping and the skipping to be able to do that. Is there anything that you do that may help younger coaches who are trying to develop speed, but they're trying to do it whilst these guys and girls are sprinting maximally and thinking, where do I start? Like, there's so much going on. How can we help younger coaches to be able to understand where they should be spending their time?
So I think it was Micheál actually that mentioned posture. So John's so bang on there. Like, I started off life like kinogramming everything, and I was like, these shapes are awesome, but they're getting slower. What's going on? And really what you realize is like the shapes are just, they tell you a snapshot of a much bigger story. How the athlete got to those shapes is really what we're after. Are they, and it took me a while to understand this concept, are they proximal to distal? Are they hip dominant versus knee dominant? Are they hip dominant versus spine dominant? And once you start to recognize that pattern, and that's a really posturally isometric postural holds, isometric postural holds into reactive steps and marches, box drills, banded sled, banded walks, banded marches, banded exchanges, banded sled works, your dribbles, all those really basic lower down the pyramid exercises are such a great place to start, because not only do they slow things down for the athlete and maybe even the coach, that's also something that nobody really speaks about. Sometimes slowing it down for the coach is really helpful as well. It slows down and it contextualizes what it is that they're doing to try and achieve the shapes that we're talking about. And I think that's really, really key. So for example, with some of the younger guys that I work with, we'll literally just try some static A-frame holds with a ball overhead. And then maybe I'll put a band above their head and be behind them holding it. And they've got to hold that shape and close their ribs down and control their diaphragm and understand, how do I extend one limb and flex the other limb, and keep that posture in a position where they feel strong and able to switch limbs effectively. And that can be something that's really, really simple, that actually permits the coach to see what's going on and the pattern of movement that the athlete prefers, but most importantly, contextualizes what it is that we're trying to help them feel when they start to speed up the movement. And that stuff would go from into boom booms, which is basically just A switches, into boom booms that move, to high knees, to dribbles. And I think dribbles are just one of the best ways to begin to coach people how to live in that elastic environment of running upright and running efficiently. I think it coaches people to, like John was saying, I love that, like the dot on the knee and pick your knee up, to give you effectively what we're trying to tell them is, let's see, can you separate your limbs? Can you prepare enough early enough to hit down with force? And can you do it elastically and stay tall? And the dribble is such a good way to bring that down and contextualize those things. And often what you can get if you're on the track, you can get sound feedback, you can get visual feedback, and then probably most importantly, you get lots and lots of kinesthetic feedback from the athlete. They can feel it if they're doing it right or wrong. They can tell if they've got a soft ankle or a stiff pre-tensed ankle. And I think when you start to come up with drills, nobody's come up with a dribble, it's been around forever, but if we start to use dribbles or certain drills that give really solid feedback to the athlete without the coach having to go into loads and loads of detail, I think that's where I would start as a younger coach. And even now, coaching day in, day out, I still use it. Even with the best athletes that I work with, those guys are still, I recognize that my left foot just wasn't tensed enough. I wasn't creating enough punch or sound. And they go back and they fix it. Maybe we'll do a couple of box series drills to kind of almost try and find the coordination to pre-tense and hit and bounce a little bit more. So that would be my advice. And then from an acceleration point of view, just go on the sled. Like a heavy sled is such a good teaching and training tool. Like it trains, yes, Micheál. It trains the physical qualities necessary to increase your ratio of force, your horizontal impulse. And it also makes you feel really dumb if you don't do it right. And I think that's such a great coaching tool. Like what's better than like feeling stupid when you've done it wrong and actually, I'm going to fix that. I'm going to push my hips through. I'm not going to move my back up and down because I feel like I'm going to get pulled off the edge of the world. That's actually that's a really strong training tool without much coaching intervention. And that to me is a win-win.
So much nodding going on there. Good work. John, did you want to unmute your mic to?
I was just, I mean, to basically get a verbal nod, give Alan a verbal nod, I suppose. I think one of the things is like I said, I mean, I like to film everything. I like to try to keep track of everything and have a record of whatever we've done, whether it be from a team group standpoint or the individual. But one thing that I always urge young coaches to be cautious of is losing the moment. We were talking about like the sounds, and I think that's such a big piece, not only to what's happening in the session, but also to the mental imagery of what you're imagining yourself to accomplish, whatever you want the rep to look like. I think the sound, the feel of it, and that's not just for the athlete. I think that's also for the coach. So one thing that I express caution with young coaches is I like to film, but you also can't be so wrapped up into recording the rep at the right angle that you miss the moment and you lose the moment. There's got to be an element of that as well.
Cool. Micheál?
Yeah, just real 2 quick points, just one on the constraint and non-constraint. I totally agree. Building off what Alan was talking about, from a non-constraint standpoint, I love the pogo hop because I think you can cue them to externally, to get them to perform it. But for them to internally feel what they should be feeling, slowing it down, like one of the common things I notice is people do pogo hops with their toes pointed down like a ballerina, and just telling them that it should be like you're sitting down, tapping to the beat of a song, and the contact there is that mid foot or the ball of the foot, and getting that feel, and then to start letting them know, can you feel the stiffness? Can you feel that it's more like a golf ball hitting the ground and less like a tennis ball? And there's stiffness in it, and then transcending that, slowing it down into when you're running upright, be relaxed and actually feel that stiffness and that contact the ground. And then the last thing real quick, just totally agree on the constraint. I've just had huge success with constraint-based approach for young athletes. Just the younger they are even, it's unstructured, but it's random stimuli. I'll put them over speed stuff. Just give them a random varied stimulus while there's this rapid learning effect. And even at that 8 to 12, reinforcing and introducing them to different forms of training modalities, because that physiologically, the brain's actually pruning itself during that period of time and honing in on neural pathways. So just those 2 points, I fully agree. And I think it's really important to emphasize.
Perfect. Thanks, mate. Any questions people have got? Chat box, Q&A. We've had one come in, which we'll get to in the last 10 minutes. But just before we do, coming back to you, John, and you spoke about it right at the start, introducing games and speed training with youth athletes. How would you go about that? And when, you've probably answered it already, but how?
Yeah, I think fun also always needs to be something that's at least the initial thought of what we're doing. I mean, the kids generally, the students that I see, I mean, they might sign up for my personal fitness class and their parents made them sign up for it. But generally they're in there probably to better themselves for a sport, or in and of itself, that training is fun and enjoyable. And I want that to always be with them, no matter really who it is. So to me, the when, I think as early as day one, I think there's certain things, again, why use words to coach something when we can just set out an environment for them and they can go have fun and probably accomplish what we wanted to anyway. So I think it can be as early as possible. And I know this is a super simple answer, but it can be as early as possible. And how, I mean, it could be a wide range of things. Again, a game is a race, to tag, to sharks and minnows, to something that might involve some sort of implementer ball or something that might not. But
what's your favorite, John? What's your favorite? What goes down an absolute storm every time you pull it out?
Sharks and minnows is our game. That's generally like, that might be our warm up on a daily basis. That might be the way that we kind of do some of our quote unquote energy system development. And a lot of my team sport coaches, especially with like the American mentality, and I don't mean that in such a negative way as I have an American flag behind me, but is especially in American football, like we've got to run our quarter gassers and half gassers, and that's how we get mentally tough for our sport. Obviously, that's not something that I agree with. And generally when our coaches are out there and they're able to see these games and they're able to see that our athletes, their effort is tenfold, if not more, when we're playing a game, and they're just about on their face to finish because of the effort that they put out there and they laid it all out there, unlike what it would probably look like when it's a half gasser, that those kids that are at the top are really just cruising and jogging. The kids at the bottom just feel bad about themselves because everybody's beating them and everybody's doing it easily. And why are we doing something that's so tough for me but easy for them? That's generally what we see when it's especially like some sort of conditioning idea. I'd much rather make it something that's fun, that again, whether it be conditioning and it's kind of negative thoughts, this is hard, this isn't fun, and taking those thoughts away from them and having them just go out and have fun, or a technical aspect of again, I can coach them and cue them on certain things, or they can go out and sprint as fast as possible, and hopefully the cues and the drills on the front end had enough context to carry with them there. So again, trying to take like whatever we can throw at them to take the thought out of it a little bit is something that I'm absolutely all for, and games are a great way to do that as early as you got them.
Superb. Anyone that's unsure, sharks and minnows, quick explanation.
It is basically, it's tag.
Okay.
And you have a shark or more than one shark, and ultimately, again, just using an American football field, you go from sideline, it doesn't matter what field, but you go from sideline to sideline. The minnows have to run from sideline to sideline. You probably have a couple sharks because we have potentially a very large group. So you have a few sharks, you tap a minnow and they're now a shark. So now you have, if you tap two minnows and there were two sharks initially, now you got four sharks that are tapping more minnows. And then ultimately your last person, and yeah, it still ends up typically being the fastest, most athletic person there. But again, that person that's at maybe a higher level of athleticism, so to speak, and bear with me on those words there, but usually that person is probably the most taxed because they're doing the most running. So I think it becomes a little more relative to who the athlete is and who their ability is and the extent at which they're running in quote unquote conditioning that presents really well for us. And it's a fit for no matter who we have out there. Cause really my track and field season, I could have everyone from a sixth grade girl that's only there because she's trying to find a sport to potential future collegiate sprinter on the boys or girls side as seniors. So meaning in sixth grade here is about 11 years old on the 17 or 18. And it's a little bit of everybody. And again, we can find a way that's still appropriate for that large group.
Love it, John. Alan, did you unmute or was that That was a fleeting unmute.
Yeah, sorry, I did mean to, but I just clicked it very quickly. It got me thinking. Games got me thinking about a conversation that I've been having recently a lot, and it's about this idea that some coaches and even some athletes don't believe that isolated speed training will allow them to be quicker in the game, for whatever reason that they argue against that. And I think the game stuff that John's talking about is such a great way to bridge the gap between the two. And very, very quickly, because I know we don't have time, I would refer to that as the gray zone, the disconnect between track, linear, straight line speed, and lots of technical work into what is a very chaotic and highly almost combative, stressful environment. And it comes down to this concept that I think called attentional reserve. And when I am not familiar with something, so in a game scenario or a match play scenario, my ability to actually focus on what I'm trying to do from a technical point of view or an evasion point of view is limited. And by introducing these games throughout, once you've developed some level of competency in straight line speed, I think you have to stress it in a game style environment. You have to stress it in curvilinear, multilinear, 3D, loads of layers of competition and decision making, because if you don't, the jump from linear speed to the game is just too high that it's very likely that it's not going to transfer across. So I actually think that what John's talking about there on those cool games, and those games can become more game representative or situationally representative over time, is actually the key to the transfer of sport speed or game speed, which is what we've been having our conversation on lately. So I think that the games discussion is hugely pivotal and important right now. So yeah, I just thought I'd add in my 2 cents and I'll unmute myself.
Yeah, I love it, mate. Again, questions, pop it in the Q&A on the chat and we'll get to it in 5 minutes. Micheál, resisted sprints. Did a little celebration when it got mentioned a minute ago. Let's have a little chat around that and how it can be used with youth athletes when it comes to wanting to get them fast.
How long have you got?
5 minutes.
No, look. I mean, look, yeah, I think I joked with that, but I should get an award for not talking about resisted sprints for the last 50 minutes. I don't think I've mentioned them yet. So, but no, to be honest, I suppose really with 5 minutes, what I'll just do, in my opinion, is clarify what it is and what it isn't. And just give a few examples. You know, I joke there, and please don't put just me with a big thumbs up to Alan on social media, or it'll become even more polarized that that's all that I do is resisted sprinting. But because what it is it's a tool in a toolbox. And I've always said that resisted sprinting should supplement a well-rounded sprint program, and it should not substitute for unresisted sprinting or traditional strength training. It should complement it, but not replace it. So, you know, what I do is I call resisted sprinting a horizontal strength training exercise, or a sprint specific training as well, sprint specific strength or horizontal strength training. You know, where I use it most is I use it in the transition phase from the turf, where we're working on our jump and sprinting ability or trying to improve the power to body mass ratio. I use it in between that and when we get into the weight room or your traditional strength training. And that's where I put my horizontal strength training in. I think it's most effective in improving the initial acceleration phase. And you say, well, how's that? You say, well, you can't argue with physics, because, you know, to improve initial acceleration is horizontal force divided by body mass, you know, so that's what it improves. And then here's the thing, it can be bad. If you use it as a pill for every ill or solely isolate it, you're only going to focus on the initial acceleration phase. And what's going to happen is you'll probably get a maladaptation in your actual max velocity or ability in how much of a peak you can achieve. Can it have benefits? Can it have benefits kinetically and kinematically? Most important to me is that's the chicken and the egg, is the kinetics versus kinematics, and how one helps the other. Is that it might not increase your net force, but what it might do is optimize the direction of force. And what it might do is increase the horizontal force application, or at least the capability of it. And the degradation in sprint mechanics can actually lead to positive chronic alterations in sprinting. For example, you could just hone in on the forward lean, and that in turn might affect the orientation of the foot strike. Now, it comes into the technical element of, well, what about it from a technical standpoint? I say, well, I'm doing a sled push here. Of course, it's going to affect sprint mechanics. You're bloody pushing it with your hands. Like, you know, so, but what I am trying to do is hone in on one area, be it that horizontal, that forward lean. And then what that can do is it may actually work as a progression to apply a total body horizontal force, which I use sometimes sled pushing. I only ever use sled pushing at really heavy loads. And the reason being, it's an anterior constraint. Whereas if you put it at light loads and you try push it at faster velocities, you'll actually find that it gets out too far in front, your lower back rounds, your hips cock up, and you lose all postural integrity, and you're not optimizing the orientation of force. So the other thing is, yeah, you just mentioned there, Rob, about technical ability. I'll kind of finish on this, is that just take the sled push, which I use preparatory to going to sled pulling only if I have time, is I'll just use a sled push as a progression from a wall drill. I'll just call it a dynamic wall drill. So you are in a static position to where you're working on that load and lift technique, and then you just start moving it horizontally. What I think we need to do is start looking at some resisted strength training as a horizontal strength training exercise and treat it like a back squat. Would you apply to a team? Would you apply, this is what I'll leave you with, would you apply percent body mass to a big group? No, you'd spend hours trying to get the velocity of the bar or 87.5% in the hope that it transcends to sprint specific, maybe alterations. Well, would you also just prescribe back spot and walk back into your office and sit down and do some? No, you'd coach it. And you have to coach resisted sled training. You have to coach angles. You have to ensure you treat it like you're coaching a traditional strength training exercise, because it's not just going to fix it for you. You got to ensure and find a load that optimizes the orientation of the foot strike, the forward lean, whatever you're trying to emphasize, be it you're putting an emphasis on trying to increase the kinetics, or you want to focus more on the kinematics. So that's I think I kept it to 5 minutes, Rob, but that's a little.
You absolutely did. There's plenty of nodding going on there as well, which I love. One last one. This might be good for you, John, given the big groups question as well. How to keep kids entertained / engage between reps?
Yeah, so that's actually an absolutely great question. And I do think it's going to depend on the setting. I think it's going to depend on who you have, not just as from a student athlete standpoint, but in my instance, I mean, perfect example, I just said that I might have everyone from a young lady in 6th grade, 11 years old, to a young man that's 18 years old. And they're generally in the same program and doing some similar, at least, training methodologies. What I've done personally, and I'm talking about 80 to 100 students probably at once, is if you have the opportunity, number one, if it's that large scale, hopefully you have the opportunity to hire or find somebody that's going to help you. Because the first year, so I've been the strength and conditioning coordinator here for 8 years, track and field coach for 5. So my first year, I was like, I'm just going to do it like the strength and conditioning program. I'm on my own there and I can do that. And that was such a failure, because I did have a large number of students. It was immensely successful how many students wanted to come out to the track, but we did have a lot of standing around, a lot of waiting around. I'm generally low volume to begin with, so it's not going to be something that we're just out there just doing stuff for whatever extent of time we have. So what I've done, again, I'm in a school setting, so I found the right people that are almost going to be more so than coaches. They're like engagement coaches. So I'll split them up into groups with the primary idea solely of shrinking those groups a little bit, spreading them out. And they're not necessarily, there might be a training quality that's accomplished at a group. Maybe we have a plyometric station and then a fly 30 station or something like that, that is applicable to and kind of conducive to both. But then we might have another station that's it could be one of those fun games. It could be something that, again, is kind of just keeping them engaged to the entire session. So, and then in individual, like if you're talking about a dozen athletes and it's only you, there's a couple ways you can do it. I've seen great coaches that have instructed on specifics. It might be positions. It might be just general movement signatures that if you educate your athletes enough on, they might be able to provide some feedback in themselves, which you still have to be cautious of, because I'm super cautious about my own words, because sometimes I struggle to say the right thing. You might then get something even worse from a young student athlete, of course. That might be a cue that's just completely maybe unhelpful. So, I think that's the best route. I think there might be a little bit more detail that I would have to know of who it is, but I think there's ways that you can stay engaged. It could be having the athletes reflect on their previous rep by themselves. If you record their rep, maybe you record every other. So I record one athlete while the next athlete's going. Athlete number one's able to view their own film and give their own personal feedback to themselves, and kind of see what how they feel after watching that repetition. So I know it's a little more complicated than just simply giving an answer. I think finding the best, I think we all have strengths and qualities that make the athletes enjoy their time with us, and that's engagement in themselves, in itself. So I think using your strengths, using the qualities that probably got those athletes out there to train with you to begin with, is going to be way more helpful than telling you how we necessarily do it. Again, the coaches that I hire for my track and field program, I have a brilliant hurdles coach. Everybody else, for the most part, brilliant distance running coach. But everybody else generally are people on campus that I know are going to be engaging. I know they're going to encourage students to come out for our program, be a part of it, and ultimately kind of just create a super positive environment for our students. And that's ultimately engagement in itself. If the athlete wants to be there and likes to be there, they're not, disengaged. Now they might get chatty with their friends, their kids, but again, it's about finding it's the art of coaching, so to speak, versus a scientific question that I could give you.
John, superb. Thank you very much. Well, we'll round it up there, but really appreciate your insights, giving up some of your evening/afternoon to join us. Alan, Micheál, John, I'll speak to you all three of you soon.